Perfect. Thank you. All right. So today, we're going to talk about personality for most of the session. Okay. And that's where we're at week 7.
Okay. Wow, why do we have a Bentley's menu up there?
Okay. So this is like at the beginning, I tried to kind of keep you guys guessing. Uh, Gluten-free? Probably. I think there is stuff that's gluten-free on the Bentley's menu. But the reason why I put up the Bentley's menu is that what we've done up to now is kind of the appetizers, right? And today we're going to start the main course. And the main course is personality. So what you'll see is that the forthcoming sessions for a long time, they all have to do with personality. They have to do with understanding our personality, what shapes our personality, and how we can change, some aspects of our personality. So far it's been kind of a warm-up thing. It's the appetizers. The personality is kind of, and for many weeks we're going to talk about this. And today's just an introduction, but it's kind of the main course. And then internal family system is going to be the dessert. So is that good? Yeah. A lot of pressure to come up with these. Yeah. All right. So I'll do these 2 or 3 slides, and then you guys take over, okay? So just to give you a little bit more about the importance of personality, there's a quotation there that you probably all know: to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. So, okay. Yeah. The phrase know thyself, know thyself, was carved in the temple of Apollo at Delphi, which is a town in southern Greece. And this was like long before Socrates lived, although the quotation is attributed to Socrates, but Greeks were saying this long before Socrates. Socrates made it central to his philosophy. He believed that almost all human error and unhappiness comes from ignorance and from not truly understanding what we are, what we value, and what we are doing. Okay. For Socrates, knowing oneself was the beginning of wisdom. He said, "I know that I do not know," which meant he recognized his own ignorance. That humility opened the way to genuine understanding and inquiry, which is what philosophy was about. For Socrates, knowing oneself was the foundation of virtue. He believed that if a person truly knew what he was, what was good, they would naturally live a good and just life. Evil or wrongdoing, in his view, came from not knowing oneself or what was truly good. Also, for Socrates, knowing oneself was the path to a meaningful life. At his trial, he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Self-knowledge wasn't just optimal reflection, it was our most important task in life. Know thyself means more than understanding our personalities. So it's more than that. It means understanding the nature of our soul, our reason, desires, and sense of justice. It means recognizing our limitations and ignorance so that we can seek truth rather than presume we already have it. Know thyself means aligning our inner life, so our thoughts, intentions, and values, with our outer actions, seeking integrity between who we are and how we live. For Socrates, the goal of life was to know what sort of being we truly are and how to live a good, unexamined, and coherent life. While understanding our personalities is only a part of what Socrates meant by know thyself, it is a critical step in that endeavor. Okay. So it's tempting to think that we fall into holes not because of anything we do, but because of what happens to us and because of other people's actions, what other people do. Sometimes that's the case, but the concept of emotional dysregulation suggests that our patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior, that is our personality, which we're going to begin talking about today, also play a significant role in our hole falling. Often, as Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. So becoming aware of and learning about the holes we frequently fall into is a critical step if we want to get out of holes faster and eventually learn to avoid them altogether. This involves understanding our personalities or our patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. That's why personality is so important to all of this. Okay. Today, and for much of the remainder of the course, we're going to, as Socrates advised, try to deepen our self-understanding by considering what personality is. Often we can't control what happens to us or how others treat us, but if we are mindful of how we think, feel, and behave, we can learn to avoid many holes and live happier and more meaningful lives. So that's the goal of, the course. For the course, we have adapted and slightly modified the Serenity Prayer, which many of you are probably familiar with. And for the purpose of the course, we kind of changed it a little bit and transformed into, may the mystery that is behind the existence of the universe grant me the serenity to radically accept the things I can't change, remind me of the tools, skills, and strategies I need to change, those that I can, and the wise mind to know the difference. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction to personality and why it's so important. All right. Oops.
First, we're just going to invite you to check in with your dashboard. So spend a few moments checking in. What is the current risk that I'll experience a state of crisis? Low, moderate, high, very high, or extreme? Am I in the window of tolerance? Yes, I'm a little outside or very outside. Where is my energy tank right now? Full, 3/4, half, or near empty? Have I been tracking my targets using the Holes diary card? How would I rate my targets right now?
First off, is the lighting okay at the moment for people in the room? Okay. So our mindfulness exercise today is box breathing. This is something that we do very slowly. So I'll read along the directions and please feel free to participate if you're comfortable. Sorry, I just got to remove that. Okay. Box breathing, just to let you know, is also called square breathing. So if you think of a square, it's a simple but powerful mindfulness technique used to calm the body and focus the mind. It's called box breathing because each part of the breath, inhale, hold, exhale, hold, takes the same length of time, forming the 4 equal sides of a box or a square. This exercise helps to regulate the nervous system, lower stress, and improve concentration. Okay, so let's begin. First, find a comfortable position, sitting upright but relaxed. Feel your feet grounded, your shoulders loose, your hands resting easily. If you feel comfortable, gently close your eyes or soften your gaze. Take a slow breath in through your nose and exhale gently through your mouth. Let your body begin to settle. We'll be breathing in a 4-part rhythm, like the sides of a box. Inhale on 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts, hold again for 4 counts. I'll count us through a few rounds. Then we'll continue quietly together. Ready? Let's begin. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Sorry, it's not changing the screen. I'm sorry. Okay, let's repeat slowly 5 or 6 more times, keeping your tone calm and rhythmic. You can remind them halfway through. If your mind wanders, just notice it kindly and come back to the steady rhythm of your breath. So again, let's together inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Again, inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Again, inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Now one more time together. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. Now release the counting and let your breathing return to its natural pace. Notice how your body feels, perhaps a little more grounded, hopefully, more steady or more spacious inside. Take one final slow, full breath in and let it go. When you're ready, gently open your eyes or lift your gaze. Hopefully you found that relaxing.
Just some reminders, this time of year, things get a little messy. So if you could leave your outdoor footwear either here on this mat or at the other door under the benches and just bring slippers or indoor footwear, that would be great.
Yes, and this is just our practice session schedule. Our next practice session will be on week 10, which is December 3rd. And that is with the chain analysis practice, and Dinko has kindly volunteered to do that.
This is the homework from last week. And this is the homework for the coming week. Take a picture or a screenshot. We're going to submit questions or comments to itssimple2023@gmail.com. Read the skills training workbook, pages 69 to 90, all of the physiological distress tolerance skills. Read the simple manual, session 11, that's the gray manual. Have targets in your diary card and use it. Continue reviewing and practicing your crisis plans. And keep tracking and practicing the skills you're learning in the window of tolerance.
Okay, and here are poll questions from last week. Sorry, Sorry, do I admit them or do I
No.
do it?
No, Lauren.
Okay. So the first question, do we want me to read through the poll response? This is for in person, the responses. Question 1 was concerning crisis plans. A, I have come up with the crisis plan and I'm using it to prepare for a possible future crisis. 24% of participants responded to that. B, for me, crisis plans are still a work in progress. That was 67%. C, I confess I haven't really worked on a crisis plan. That was about 10%. Question 2, concerning Holds diary cards. A, I have a Holds diary card and I have picked between 1 and 3 targets for change. That was 67%. B, for me, Holds diary cards are still a work in progress, about 19%. And C, I confess I haven't really worked on the Holds diary card. That was 19%. Question 3, concerning the distress tolerance skills that we are going through with myself and Nicole. A, I've chosen a few distress tolerance skills that I think might help me in a crisis from among all the ones that we have reviewed. That was 71%. That was good to see. B, for me, picking a few distress tolerance skills that might help me in a crisis is still a work in progress. That was 24%. And C, I confessed I haven't thought much about picking distress tolerance skills that might help me in a crisis, and that was 5%. Question 4, which of the following best describes why you sometimes find it difficult to do the homework or exercises between sessions? And this was multiple choice. A, I forgot about the homework between sessions, 10%. I run out of time or have too many other commitments, 29%. I'm not clear on what exactly I'm supposed to do, 24%. The assignments feel too long or complicated, 5%. I start but don't finish because I lose focus or motivation. That was 24%. F, I feel anxious or self-critical when I try to do it. 19%. G, I worry about doing it wrong. That was 24%. H, the homework brings up uncomfortable emotions, so I avoid it. 24%. I don't feel confident that it will help me. 5%. J, I'm just too tired or emotionally drained to do it. That was 52%. K, I feel disconnected from the group. That was 5%. L, I don't see the personal relevance of the homework. That was 0%. M, I want to do it, but I procrastinate until it's too late. That was 43%. N, I'm not sure what the deeper purpose of the homework is. That was 0%. O, I'm questioning the overall framework of the course. 0%. And finally, P, the material feels too abstract or too intense for where I'm at right now. And that was 0%. And then there was a couple of people who indicated they get outside the window of tolerance. That was 5%. Or I keep losing sheets, so organizing was an issue, and that was 5%. Question 5, what would help you do the homework more regularly? Again, this was multiple choice. A, clearer or more concrete instructions for each assignment, 19%. Shorter, B, shorter or simpler exercises, 19%. C, pairing up with a homework buddy for accountability or support, or having a homework group, 38%. And then D, briefly discussing the past week's homework at each of the sessions, 43%. E, knowing that others are also struggling, 29%. F, understanding the why or purpose behind each exercise, 19%. G, having an example or model to follow, 24%. H, being able to adapt the homework to fit my week's style is 14%. I, a brief midweek email reminding me of the homework was 29%. And J, please email us with any other suggestions that you can think of that might make doing the homework easier, and 0% responded to that. And the last question 6 we addressed last week, it was about, are you interested in a homework group on Mondays at 12:30 to 1, just before the Boeing group? And it started this week. 33% of the people in person said yes, and 57% indicated no, thank you. And I think one person thought maybe unsure. And in addressing the homework group, I just want to bring up, for those who are participating, there will be no homework group on Monday, December 1st, because the room is not available. Boeing group will be offered at 1 o'clock as usual, but the homework group will not be available that week.
Great. So
Mhm.
my summary for session 6, we learned more advanced distress tolerance skills, living in the present moment, self-encouraging coping thoughts, radical acceptance that we keep bringing up over and over again, self-affirming statements, creating new coping strategies, and an emergency coping plan. So at this point, we have the 20 distress tolerance skills on our updated personal skills list. And you don't have to choose all of them, but try to pick 2 or 3 that you find really resonate with you and that you can pull out in a crisis. Practice them when you are calm and alert so that you really get a feel for them, so that when you are in crisis, they come more naturally.
And our weekly announcements. Again, we're still looking for volunteers for the practices of the tools. So please email us if you're interested in volunteering. We had our 3rd Boeing group this past Monday on November 10th. 10 people came. We worked on finding targets for the Holes Diary card. Next Monday, we can talk about any of the material we've covered so far, the distress tolerance skills, crisis plans, Holes Diary cards, the techniques and strategies, suicidal thinking, and self-harm. Anything else you can think of, we're open to that. Email us questions or subjects you would like to talk about, or let us know what they are when we do the Boeing check-in. We also had our first homework group, to which 2 people came. We suggest a possible format for the homework group, and that'll be on the next slide. And for people here in person, we have a paper copy that you can refer to. We also discussed using a homework habits checklist, which can help anyone improve their homework habits. Keep it in your binder in the tabs for each of the 32 weeks, completed each week. This might be especially helpful for neurodivergent people. People if you struggle with attention deficit symptoms, might be helpful to have this checklist. And this is the structure for the homework group. So the purpose of it is to support each other in following through with course tools, skills, and strategies without advice giving. Time structure, 15 minutes per person if groups of 2 to 10 minutes, of 2 or 10 minutes if groups of 3. So 1 minute, we do a quick intro, 1 breath check-in with personal dashboard, window of tolerance, crisis risk, and your energy levels. Then there's 14 minutes for guiding through homework reflection. And there's different roles here. The reflector shares honestly about homework progress and obstacles. There's a sounding board, mostly listening. No advice, just listening. Use curiosity, not fixing. Witness, this may be optional. If 3 people, this person gently keeps time and structure. Reflection questions, and you can write your answers. 1, clarify. Do I understand all items of the homework? What feels unclear? 2, follow through. Did I do the homework this week? If not, what didn't I do and what got in the way? And 3, process and habits. Am I approaching the homework effectively? Which homework habit will I commit to this week? Next action, what is one small concrete step I will take before our next meeting? And then there's a closing, roughly 15 seconds, give or take. The reflector states that they're tiny next steps, one sentence that you're going to do. A sounding board, their job is to help the reflector hear themselves, not fix them. And then this is the homework habits checklist we were talking about that might help you, whether you participate in the homework group or not, just with completing some of the tools and strategies. So circle or check what you will try this week. Preparation habits, making your workbooks and your pen and paper accessible. Schedule a specific time for your homework and keep it kind of part of your regular routine. I choose a consistent location with minimal distractions to do the work. And I gather what I need ahead of time. That's part of the preparation. And then to focus and pacing habits. Start with a tiny step. Don't overwhelm and say you're going to do it all in one sitting. Start with 2 to 5 minutes. Maybe perhaps use a timer on your phone so you don't go over time. Remove distractions. Phone away, unless you're using it for a timer. TV off, quiet space, do not disturb sign if you can on a room where you can do your homework. And 3, tracking and organizations habits. Keep materials in one place, in a binder, a folder. Write down insights right after doing the homework. And 4, this is very important, be kind to yourself, self-compassion habits. Aim for progress, not perfection. Notice resistance without judging yourself. And 5, accountability habits. Review your week, what worked, what didn't, and share honestly with your buddy, even when you didn't do it. Here is a micro commitment. This week, I will focus on blank at this time, at this place, the tiny step, remember, have a timer, and anything other that will apply to you.
Why do so many mindfulness exercises focus on the breath? Did you want to share this, Joan?
There is a lot, and it's finding, like today we did box breathing. I mean, there's so many breathing exercises. So mindfulness practices often center on the breath because the breath sits at a unique intersection between your body and your mind and involuntary and voluntary control. The breath is always with you, wherever you are. Unlike physical sensations that come and go or thoughts that drift, breathing is continuous and it's rhythmic. That makes it an ideal anchor for attention and gently bringing the wandering mind back to the here and now. Breathing is one of the few bodily functions that can be both automatic, run by the automatic nervous system, and conscious, something we control. When we attend to breathing, we are literally placing awareness at the threshold between unconscious processes and voluntary awareness, the same threshold mindfulness seeks to eliminate. So if you're really anxious, I know for me, I'm not consciously aware that I'm actually holding my breath or breathing too shallow. So when you bring the awareness into that and focus on getting that breath in deeply, it can have an immediate calming effect. Because when you get more oxygen into your lungs, that oxygen can release tension in your body. So it's becoming really aware. And that's why mindfulness exercises incorporate a lot of breathing. Slow, steady breathing directly influences the vagus nerve and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which slows the heart rate, reduces stress hormones, and grounds us. This is science. There's data to support this. This makes the breath a built-in regulator of emotional and physiological arousal, a safe and immediate way to bring us back into the window of emotional tolerance or a calm and alert state. Breath awareness crosses all cultures and religious traditions. It requires no belief system, no special equipment, and no advanced training. Anyone can begin by noticing a single inhale and exhale. The breath continually arises and passes away. Observing this rhythm mirrors the importance of all experiences, sensations, thoughts, and emotions. It becomes a living metaphor for acceptance and letting go, central to mindfulness practice.
So can we explain why we've mentioned brief or one breath sharing so many times? When we share in a group, there's a natural rhythm to attention. In the beginning of someone sharing, people are tuned in, they're curious and open. But as the sharing continues, the attention starts to drift, not because what's being said isn't valuable, but because our minds have limits. The longer one person speaks, the less everyone can take in. It's a kind of human attention curve. The first 30 to 45 seconds are when people are the most receptive. The best way we reach others is by being brief and focused. In a short time, we can often say the heart of what matters most. A concise share invites others in. It keeps the energy moving and makes space for everyone's voice. The goal isn't to say everything, it's to say enough. When we share just enough, people really hear us, remember us, and feel connected to us. And that's the sweet spot we're aiming for.
And this next part here, how to organize a one breath or breath sharing, we're not going to review that today. So we do encourage you to go back and review that part of the slide.
So what is an instinct? What is an impulse? And how are they related? An instinct is a built-in biological program. It's automatic, not learned, and exists to ensure survival. For example, attachment seeking, fight or flight, sexuality. Instincts operate beneath conscious awareness and are shared across the species. An impulse is the moment-to-moment urge that arises from an instinct. It's the felt push to do something, like the urge to run, shout, eat, or reach out. Instinct is the source. Impulse is the expression. Instinct is the biological drive, and impulse is the immediate urge that carries that drive into action. In other words, instinct leads to impulse, leads to action.
And just highlighting what we're going to do today. We have a poll. What are your big 5 personality traits? Dr. Clado will introduce personality. We'll have a break. Then we'll have our usual time for questions, comments, reflection, and discussion. And then Kate will have her summary at the end. You go.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. You guys are great at this. So that last section was questions that people asked, maybe not just by email, but they asked here or at the Boyne group. And we try to put them up there. So keep asking, keep sending us your questions. All right, so here we go with this, as I said, is the main course. All right, so let's talk about personality. And today's more of an introduction to personality. We're going to go in more depth into this. Okay, so I've already talked a little bit about this, but I think it's really important to repeat and to explain this a little bit more. And that's the difference between what's a map and what's a territory. So we're going to be talking today about concepts like highly sensitive individuals, neurodivergence. We're going to talk about attachment disorders. We can talk a lot about that in the future, personality disorders. And so I want you guys to remember that these concepts are all maps. Okay, they're not the territory itself. There's a difference. Okay, so the difference is that a map highlights certain features of landscape so that we can navigate it better. A map of a city might show roads, but not trees or smells or sounds, which are really part of the territory, right? In the same way, these psychological maps, these concepts, or psychological labels help us to notice particular patterns, emotional sensitivity, attachment style, coping strategies, but they leave out many other aspects of what it means to be you or what a person truly is. Right? The territory is the living, breathing person, each one of us, and it's made up of countless experiences, genetic influences, relationships, and inner worlds. There's no single label, concept, or map that can capture the complexity of each one of us. Okay, so don't let these labels, they don't define you. They're just something helpful to help you navigate some territory. Concepts and labels are useful because they guide understanding, they guide research also, and they help with treatment. But they can also be limiting if we forget that they are simplifications, partial views, and not the full picture. Okay, every human being is more than any one diagnosis or label. Labels and concepts are maps that can help us find our way, but they should never lead us to think that they define a person or replace our curiosity, compassion, and openness to the full territory of a person's life. Okay, so just want to say that off the bat because we're going to be talking about a lot of things, and you may kind of, identify a little bit with this, but it doesn't define you. Okay. Okay, so let's usually when we start a topic, I like to try to define some things. And obviously we're not going to remember the definitions, but go to the website, look at the slides if you're curious about definitions might be. Okay, so what is personality? I think we've already talked about this. This is the part of the course where we repeat things over and over again. But before I define personality, let me tell you about the origins of the word personality, which I thought this was really interesting. So, the ancient Greeks, they didn't have amplifiers, and they had their plays. So Greeks started, plays, and there were some large amphitheaters, and sometimes there were up to 5,000 people attending these plays. Okay, so how did they project their voices? Right, they didn't have any amplification, no electronics in those days, and there's these amphitheaters were built into hillsides, natural hillsides, and they put seats and stuff, and then the actors were at the front. So one ingenious way they found to amplify their voices was, I'm sure you're familiar with these masks. The mask of tragedy and comedy are still, part of, theater, right? And the two masks. But, the Greeks, when they were in their plays, they all wore masks, right? And the mouth piece, so through which the sound came, was shaped in a way, it was kind of like a megaphone. So it was kind of narrow near the mouth, and then it tapered out, right? And that mouthpiece is called, in Greek, it's called a prosopon. And that's where the word personality comes from. I thought that's pretty neat, because that's what the actors were projecting, right? All right. So let's look at some definitions. And this you already know, the personality is the characteristic set of behaviors thoughts and emotional patterns that are present in an individual and evolve from biological and environmental factors. Repeatedly falling into holes is a part of personality. Avoiding holes, therefore, implies changing aspects of one's personality. Okay. We're also going to be talking about personality traits. And that's a little different from personalities. Personality traits are the specific characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving present in an individual. And today in the poll, we're going to look at some of our personality traits. So you'll have a sense of what those are. We're also going to be talking about personality classifications. And classifications are the systematic arrangement of personality into groups or categories according to established criteria. Right? So this is what psychologists do. They, classify people into different groups, again, to try to study. This is where the maps come in. So where personality classifications are maps of, complex territory. Then we have personality types. There are also personality classifications of different types of individual. Some classifications describe normal, others abnormal or disordered personality. And then this is something that, probably a lot of people have heard about, and it's a term of psychiatry. Personality disorder is a term used in psychology and psychiatry to describe psychological issues in which individuals may have rigid, unhealthy, or maladaptive patterns of thinking, feeling, or behaving. They fall into holes a lot, right? That differs significantly from what is usually expected, and that cause distress or problems functioning. In other words, they're saying there that you're falling into holes a lot, right? And there's really kind of no boundary between, personality and a personality disorder. It's kind of artificial, right? The more you fall into holes, the more, you can think of this as, oh, this is a real problem or a disorder, or yeah. So some more definitions, personality theories, which we're going to go over today. And these are the specific models or maps that strive to describe and explain, using psychological theories, the complex territory of the patterns of human feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. So I'm going to go over some of personality theories. How do we look at personality? And then there's also theories of personality development, which is, from the time of a child, what happens, like what shapes personality? We're going to be talking a lot about that. So these are explanations and descriptions of how personality develops over the lifespan. And the personality dynamics refer to the complex interplay of various psychological processes that shape an individual's personality and influence their behavior, thoughts, and emotions over time. It encompasses how different aspects of personality interact with each other and with external factors, leading to the unique ways in which a person experiences and responds to the world. Don't try to remember that, but okay. And finally, this last definition. So facade, we all have a facade, some people less, some people more. And facades are the public personality that we present, helps us to hide our complex underlying feelings, thoughts, and behavioral urges. Okay. And, in autism spectrum, they refer to this as masking. So, people, autism spectrum, they mask a lot. People with neurodivergence, they mask a lot to appear kind of okay, but everybody masks, right? To one degree or another. All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how personality is classified. And let me give you a little bit of the history, because we've been trying to classify personalities all the way back almost to the beginning of history. But the first people who really started to try to classify personality were in ancient India, the Hindus, right? Okay. So personality classifications are the ways we have tried to organize the whole gamut of human personalities into discrete types. People have been trying to make sense of personality for as long as we've been reflecting on human nature. The Hindus spoke of the three gunas. The Greeks talked about the four temperaments, and psychologists today use models like the Big Five. We're going to touch on all three of those. It's really the same quest, trying to map the rich variety of human experience and human personalities and human beings. So many different personality classifications have been proposed and used. Today, we're just going to survey a few of the many biological and psychological classifications. Okay, let's skip over that. So let's just briefly touch on Hinduism's personality theories and classifications. So this goes back to like 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So Hinduism is the most psychological of the great religions. Hinduism is also a complex social system. Its deep insights are timeless and have greatly influenced Western philosophy, culture, and psychology. Hinduism places great emphasis on understanding personality and how individuals fit into the world. So Hinduism's personality theory classifies people and their personalities according to duties, stages, and stations of life. And I'll go over each one of those in turn. So start with duties. So the Hindus thought and still think that overall humans have 4 duties, with each person leaning preferentially to one or the other. So each one of us tends to lean to one of these things. For some people, their preference or what's central in their life is pleasure. So that's A. B, for other people, it's worldly success. For other people, it's happiness. And for others yet, it's liberation or the path to God pursued through the 4 yogas: knowledge, love, work, and psychophysical exercises. And I mean, this is not, modern, so it's maybe hard for us to relate to a little bit, but when you learn about Hinduism, it starts to make sense. And so you might ask yourself, what's kind of the priority in my life of those 4? Because we probably have, a little bit of each one, but we probably have one that's a stronger drive within us. And then, the Hindus also talked about how personality develops through different stages. And they talked about how as we age, we go through different stages of life. So the first one, this is much more understandable for us, but the first stage of life is that of being a student. So you're learning, you're open. Then the second stage is the householder. So householder is like typical young adult, where you're trying to establish yourself, you're forming long-lasting relationships, having family, establishing a career, having a permanent place to live. That's all called householder. And the thing in Hinduism also is that it's normal to move through these stages. So if you get stuck at any one of these stages, that's not part of their normal development. And then when you get a little older, you become a forest dweller. So that's kind of an image. And forest dwellers are, in our culture, are people who are retired. Okay. But like if you're retired, the idea is you put out the pasture, you can do, whatever. But in Hinduism, being a forest dweller meant that, forest is the mystery, it's the unknown. You're no longer in the town. And so there are dangers there, but there's mystery there. So as a forest dweller, you went off into the forest and explored, nature and what the universe was about. And so that was for a lot of retirement. But as you got older and older, you came to a stage called the renunciate. And renunciates in ancient India, people were quite old. They're past their forest dweller stage. And for them, they were kind of like halfway between the world and the next world. And it's like the world didn't matter for them anymore. They were kind of preparing for, what comes next, right, for them. And often renunciates in India, they went around naked, right, because they didn't care for material goods anymore, right? And so which stage are you at? Okay, nobody here's the renunciate stage because you'd be naked, but okay. So, and then the third way that in Hinduism they kind of looked at personality is that they also said people fall into 4 social classes or stations. And And the first one is the seers. So these are the castes, right? In Hinduism. So the seers were the priests and teachers. Then you had the leaders, which were the nobles and warriors, the doers, which were the merchants, entrepreneurs, and business people. And then you had the followers, the workers. And again, so these three ideas defined personality for Hindus. So where are you at with respect to that? So as Hinduism evolved, this classification, the social classes, ossified into oppressive Hindu castes. Not going to talk about that, but if you want to go over the slides, what the Hindu castes are, go to the website. All right. So that was the Hindus. This is just like a little bit because I don't know, I like history. I like to see how these concepts evolved. But so the ancient Greeks were kind of, the originators of Western thought, which is like our tradition, right? Hinduism is not part of the Western thinking tradition, but the ancient Greeks are. So, what starts to resemble more our personality classification are what the ancient Greeks thought. So one of the people that was concerned about personality theories was Galen. So Galen lived in 129 to 216 of the Christian era, so more recent Greek. He was a physician who developed a biological theory of personality. So it's kind of like those days they didn't have neurotransmitters, but a biological theory of personality is, when you start talking about dopamine or epinephrine or serotonin, those are all biological theories that the brain has different functions. So in those days they didn't have like the ideas about neurotransmitters that we do today, but they had other ideas. So somebody that came before Galen, who was a prominent physician. He was the guy that came up with the Hippocratic Oath, which all doctors still take to this day. That was Hippocrates, right? He lived quite a bit before Galen, 460 to 370 before the Christian era. So Galen devised a system of medicine which held that the body was composed of humors or chemical types. And he divided it into, instead of having serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, he talked about blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, right? And he said that if all of these different humors or chemical components of the body, if they were all kind of in the right proportion, then you were well, okay? But very much like our biological theories today, that if you have like too little serotonin, then we kind of give you antidepressants and increases your serotonin or whatever, right? In those days, they had very similar theories. So, they diagnosed your illnesses and they thought, oh, this is like an imbalance. So you might have too much phlegm or too much blood or too little yellow bile, or so there are different proportions of this, right? And the practice of bleeding people, right, came from this type of approach because some people were thought just you have too much blood, so let's take away some of your blood, right? So that's all derived from Hippocrates and Galen, right? Okay, so the illnesses were the result of imbalances between the four humors, right? And so that was preceded Galen, right? That the humoral theory. But Galen applied the humoral theory to personality, and he proposed one of the earliest Western personality classifications, which divided people into phlegmatic. So those people had too much phlegm, and people who were phlegmatic, they were kind of, things change very quickly for them, very inconstant, right? Then you had people who were melancholic. They had too much black bile. And you can guess what that is because we still use melancholic, right, for people who think too much, who have a tendency to be depressed. And for Galen, it was because they had too much black bile, right? Not that different if you think about it from our modern biological theories. You have too little serotonin, right? And then you have choleric. You can also guess what that might be. So choleric people had too much yellow bile. So choleric people, might be very angry or very impulsive. And then you had people who were sanguine, so they had too much blood, and those are people that are more enthusiastic and maybe impulsive a little bit. So those were, some of the earlier classifications, which I think they begin to resemble some of our classifications today in many ways. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. Just wondering how we're doing for time. Well, you know what? I'll just go over that a little bit because I think we're doing okay for time. So Hippocrates, often regarded as the father of medicine, is associated with the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. This theory was a foundational concept in understanding human health and personality for many centuries. According to this theory, the human body is composed of four humors, or bodily fluids, and an imbalance among them could affect a person's health and temperament. And so the four humors are blood, and people had too much blood, they were sanguine. So that's associated with elements of air. Blood was thought to be linked to a sanguine temperament. People with a predominance of blood were believed to be sociable, lively, and optimistic. They were considered to have warm and moist constitution. Okay, but you can have too much blood. You have an excess of that. And then you had the phlegm, phlegmatic, associated with the element of water. Phlegm was linked to a phlegmatic temperament. Individuals in excess of phlegm were thought to be calm, reliable, and thoughtful, but also potentially sluggish or apathetic. They were considered to have a cold and moist constitution. And then you have the yellow bile. So if you have too much yellow bile, you're considered choleric. So associated with the element of fire, yellow bile was connected to a choleric temperament. People with a predominance of yellow bile were believed to be ambitious, energetic, and passionate, but also prone to anger and irritability. So there's the positive sides of each one of these, temperaments or humors, but also there's kind of, the negative side if it's too excessive. And then you had black bile, which is melancholic, associated with the element of earth. Black bile was linked to a melancholic temperament. Individuals with an excess of black bile were thought to be introspective, detail-oriented, and serious, but also susceptible to sadness and depression. They were considered to have a cold and dry constitution. And, the link there, because I talked about air, water, fire, and earth, because the Greeks thought that those were the basic components of the universe. Like today we think about its atoms or subatomic particles, right? But the Greeks thought everything is made up of air, water, fire, and earth, right? And put in different proportions, and you get everything that's out there, okay, including us. All right, so now we come to, and this is where we're going to do our poll in just 1 minute. But this is a much more modern, current, a way of kind of classifying personality, and it's called the Big Five. So the Big Five personality traits, also known as Ocean model, is a widely accepted model framework for understanding human personality. It identifies 5 broad dimensions of personality, which are believed to encompass most individual differences in personality traits. Okay, so how they did this is really interesting because they looked up in a dictionary and they came up with all the words in the dictionary that describe people, that describe personality. And there was something like, does anybody know this story? It was something like, I don't know, like thousands of different adjectives that describe personality, right? And then what they did is that they kind of like grouped all these adjectives together, right? And they were all kind of variations of these 5. So all the adjectives that we have to describe personality, they're all different. We have like thousands of them, but they could all be grouped under these 5 traits. That's how they came up with these. All right. So OCEAN is an acronym, and it stands for the Big 5 personality traits. Okay. So O stands for openness to experience. Right? So keep this in mind because I'm going to ask you in a minute in the poll, I'm going to ask you to rate yourself because this is a spectrum. So there are people, most of us are kind of in the middle. We're somewhat open, right? But some people are very, very, very open. They're kind of like, they're just out there seeking new experiences, okay? Other people, it's like, no, don't tell me about anything new. So you can be moderate, you can be extremely open, or very close to new experiences, okay? So openness to experience, this trait features characteristics such as imagination, curiosity, and broad range of interests. People high in openness are often more willing to embrace new experiences and ideas. Okay, so when we do the poll, think about how open you are, how much you embrace. We all do it a little bit, but some people do it a lot. And some people are kind of like a little bit reluctant. And this is not, it's not a judgment. It's just kind of like trying to find where you fall under, these 5 different traits. So C in ocean stands for conscientiousness. So this dimension includes high levels of thoughtfulness, good impulse control, and goal-directed behaviors. So conscientious individuals are often organized, mindful of details, and reliable. Okay, so there's people, like a moderate amount of conscientiousness is good, all right? If you're overly conscientious, you can almost be obsessive compulsive, right? So it can be like a bit of a disorder, right? But if you're not conscientious at all, it's very hard to organize yourself because, you just kind of are improvising as you go along and you may not be very organized, okay? So when we ask you, think about where you fall with respect to conscientiousness. And then extroversion is one that I think is easier to understand than the previous 2. So extroversion is characterized by excitability, sociability, talkativeness, assertiveness, and high amounts of emotional expressiveness. So extroverts, some people call it extroverts, right? Tend to be outgoing and enjoy social interactions. Other end of the spectrum is introverts. One way of describing that I like is that extroverts get their energy from being with others, whereas introverts get their energy from being by themselves, right? So when we do the poll, think of where you lie with respect to the extroversion versus introversion spectrum. And then we have the A in ocean is for agreeableness. This trait involves attributes such as trust, altruism, kindness, and affection. Agreeable individuals are often cooperative and compassionate towards others. So some people is like, yeah, I want to please other people. Other people don't care as much about that. Again, this is not a judgment, but it's a description of our personality, okay? And then the final one of the big 5 is neuroticism. So neuroticism is characterized by sadness, moodiness, and emotional instability. Individuals high in neuroticism may experience mood swings, anxiety, irritability, and sadness, okay? So if you're a very neurotic kind of person, again, it's not a judgment. These are the terms that they use. I'm not inventing this stuff. But if you're very neurotic, you're a person who worries a lot, who thinks a lot, is always in their head, right? The opposite of being neurotic is being kind of happy-go-lucky, right? You just take moment as it comes. All right. So those are some of the traits that go with which one of those, openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion. I'm not going to go over that. All right. So before we do the poll, this in the last 10 to 20 years, some psychologists have began to dispute the big 5. And they've said, really, we should have the big 6 instead of big 5. Because many people think that sensitivity, in addition to the other 5, the ocean, sensitivity should also be considered like a basic personality trait. So sensitivity refers to how strongly a person reacts to stimuli, both internal and external. People who are highly sensitive often have a heightened awareness of their surroundings and can be more affected by sensory input, emotions, and the moods of others. So the trait of sensitivity can manifest in various ways, such as being easily overwhelmed by loud noises or bright lights, having deep empathy for others, or being particularly moved by art and music. Sensitive individuals may also be more introspective and reflective, often taking time to process their experiences and emotions. While sensitivity can sometimes lead to feeling overstimulated or stressed, it also allows individuals to experience the world with a rich depth of perception and understanding. It's important to note that sensitivity is a spectrum, and people can exhibit various levels of this trait. Right? So, because this is something that's been talked about a lot lately, and under the label of neurodivergence, right? A lot of people are identifying as highly sensitive. All right. So, what is a highly sensitive person? So, the highly sensitive person trait was introduced by psychologist Elaine Aron, characterized by heightened sensory processing sensitivity. Approximately 15 to 20% of the population can be grouped under that highly sensitive person label. Like any trait, being a highly sensitive person comes with its own set of advantages and challenges, right? So there's some pros of being a highly sensitive person. So HSPs tend to think deeply about things, which can lead to greater insights and creativity. They often consider multiple perspectives and implications before making decisions. In terms of empathy and compassion, highly sensitive people are often very empathic and attuned to the emotions of others, making them excellent friends, partners, and caregivers. In terms of appreciation for beauty and art, HSPs often have a strong appreciation for art, music, and nature, experiencing them with great intensity and joy. In terms of attention to detail, they're often good at noticing subtleties that others might miss, which can be an asset in various fields such as research, art, and counseling. And in terms of intuition, many HSPs have strong intuition, often sensing things beyond the obvious and understanding complex emotional landscapes. So those are like the pros. There's also a lot of cons of being a highly sensitive person. In terms of feeling overwhelmed and stressed, HSPs can become easily overwhelmed by sensory input, such as loud noises, bright lights, or crowded places, leading to stress and fatigue. In terms of emotional reactivity, HSPs may experience emotions more intensely, which can lead to mood swings and difficulty managing stress. In terms of difficulty with change, HSPs might find it difficult to adapt to new situations or changes, as they often prefer routine and predictability. In terms of the need to be alone, HSPs often require more downtime to recharge, which can sometimes be misunderstood by others as being antisocial or withdrawn. And finally, in terms of sensitivity to criticism, HSPs can be more affected by criticism or negative feedback and may take things more personally than others. Okay, so interesting concept. Remember, this is a map. This is not, you may find yourself, oh, this map kind of, I fits me a little bit, but it's a map, right? It's not the description of the territory. These are all maps. Okay, so in a minute, we're going to do the poll. So take a minute to go through, these different adjectives, right? Well, I'm going to put those up. And before we do the poll, I want you to look at it. In the purple rectangles below, pick out the ones that apply to you. Where on the spectrum of each of these 5 ocean traits do you fall? And our poll today will ask you to rate yourself on these traits, right? So that's the spectrum, right? And go through one at a time. So start with openness. And the adjectives that on the left, so if you're low on openness, you're down to earth, pragmatic, risk averse, rational, conservative, straightforward. If you're high on openness, you're creative, curious, sensitive to aesthetics, receptive to change, tolerant, liberal. Okay, go through. Can you guys all see? Is it hard to see? You can come closer if you have trouble, but kind of write down each one of those. Openness, and then are you in the middle? Do you lean more to one side? Do you lean more to the other side? And in a second, I'm going to give you the poll questions. I'm going to ask you to tell us what you found. Okay, so take a minute to go through that. How are you guys doing? Do you need another minute? Yep, okay.
Would we actually get that printed off, like get a copy of that one? It's kind of like the feeling wheels. That screen we showed? Yeah, that would be good.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that next week. You have a slide for that, question 6. About sensitivity. It's entirely
No, that was
sensitive.
the one before. Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, how are we doing? Everybody's okay? All right. So. Okay. Lauren, do you want to launch the poll? We don't have to stop the recording yet. Okay, so you guys on Zoom, if you could do the poll, and people here in person, you have a handout, do it there. And then Joan and Nicole are going to read the results of the Zoom poll, but the in-person poll we're going to do next week. Okay.
Leave them on your table and we'll collect them.
Okay, for the Zoom participants, question number 1. For each of the 5 ocean or big 5 traits, please rate yourself high, low, or intermediate. Start with openness. So for high was
58%,
low
15%,
and intermediate.
27%,
Conscientiousness for high was
41%,
low
16. It keeps fluctuating. 16% currently
and intermediate.
is 43%.
Extroversion for high is
30%,
low
41%,
and intermediate.
30%,
Agreeableness for high was
50%,
low
9%,
and intermediate.
41%,
And for 5, neuroticism high,
56%,
low
15%,
and intermediate.
31%.
And 6, some researchers think sensitivity, as in highly sensitive people, should also be considered along the big 5 traits. Rate yourself on sensitivity. High,
71%,
low,
0%,
and intermediate.
29%.
Okay. Thank you for doing that. Right. Okay.
Sorry, Dr. Clado, I did have a couple messages that there were a few folks on Zoom that haven't finished doing the polls yet. So their results weren't included there.
Okay.
They just wanted you
Well,
to.
sorry about that. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. People here in the room are finished. I took that as a sign that people are finished, so I apologize. Okay. So, there's other personality classifications, but I'm not going to go into those. If you're interested, the slides are there, so look at the website. This was an interesting one, Helen Fisher's personality types. She says their people are classified into directors, negotiators, builders, explorers, kind of resembles the Hindus a lot. And it's very much also like the humoral theory, because she talks about balance of estrogen, testosterone, serotonin, and dopamine. So it's kind of like the humoral theory. If you have excess of phlegm or bile, but with her, it's more testosterone, and she has ways of measuring, and she's like a serious neuroscientist. So it's interesting. Another map, right? And so people like this map, but I won't go into it too much. And then Carl Jung's personality types and Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is an adaptation of Carl Jung, more complex form of Carl Jung. And this is used a lot in business still today. And this is a really interesting one called the Enneagram. This Enneagram is used a lot in spiritual direction. And for some reason, Jesuits use it a lot. It's really complex. I don't really understand it, although I've read about it, but it's very complex. You have to really get into it. But I think it can be very helpful. There's Richard Rohr. He's a writer. I don't know if you guys know Richard Rohr. He talks a lot about the Enneagram. He's a Catholic priest. He was a little bit of a maverick, right? But he's a fabulous writer. Okay. So before we break, let's talk about disorders. So talk about this, and then think after that we'll all need a break. So personality disorders. Are people familiar with the DSM? Put your hands up if you're familiar with DSM. Yeah, so quite a few people. Some aren't. But the DSM also, it's a short version of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Okay. When I started psychiatry, the DSM-3 had just came out in 1980. DSM-3. There isn't like a DSM-1 or 2. I don't know what they just made up, but DSM-3, it started with 3, right, in 1980. And in 2013, we had the latest version, which is DSM-5. So it's kind of progressed through various revisions. And now there's a DSM-5 TR. So it's not a major revision, but they revise it a little bit. But from the DSM-3, which is like, a little book like that, DSM-5 is like 900 pages. And this is classification of all the diagnoses that we can make in psychiatry. All right. So forget how many diagnoses, I think I wrote it there somewhere. But of the hundreds and hundreds of diagnoses, most psychologists, psychiatrists just use like 10 at most, not more than that. But there's hundreds of them. It's just we totally ignore all the other ones, right? Just use a few of them. So DSM is a comprehensive classification system used by mental health professionals, from psychologists to social workers to psychiatrists, to diagnose and classify mental disorders. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it makes like a huge amount of money for the American Psychiatric Association, because the book now, it's like $150 or something for the hardcover version of it. And it provides standardized criteria and language for diagnosing mental health conditions. And how they do it, and there's nowhere else in medicine that they do this, but they get committees of experts. So you have an expert in the field of depression, right? You get them all together, and then they come up with what the criterion is for depression. But they kind of make up what these are, because in a lot of other fields in medicine, you actually have what are called biomarkers. So you have blood tests, you have x-rays, you have, other stuff that will kind of point, or, MRIs or echocardiograms or whatever, that give you a sense of what the real physiology of the condition is, right? But in psychiatry, we don't have any of that. We don't have biomarkers. We don't, we talk about high serotonin, low serotonin. That's very research. We don't kind of measure people's serotonin or dopamine, right? Theoretically, we could by doing spinal taps, but who does that, right? Yeah, it's these groups of panels or committees that come up with definitions for many, many different things. And then we all kind of follow. And when we see a person, we ask them questions, and then we go, okay, does this person meet the criteria? We might ask those questions that are part of the definition. And if people say yes, no, we kind of do a checklist thing, and oh, this person fits this criteria. But it's very subjective, right? It's not very objective. I often do, because a lot of people come in wondering if they have attention deficit disorder. And I can give them the DSM criteria, like a little sheet, and ask them to kind of rate themselves. But it's very subjective, right? There's not like an objective measure of what it might be. So the DSM offers a common framework and language for diagnosing mental disorders, which promotes consistency and reliability across different practitioners and settings, okay? Supposed to provide consistency and flexibility. Not sure that it does. So this information is actually taken from the DSM, right? What I'm putting up there. So it's the party line. For each listed disorder, the DSM provides specific criteria that must be met for a diagnosis, including symptoms, duration, and exclusionary factors. So if you have these things, then yeah, you don't fit in that category. Disorders are grouped into categories based on similar characteristics or underlying features, such as mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and psychotic disorders. So they're grouped in DSM. You have like different sections for the depressive disorders, the personality disorders, the psychotic disorders. There's different sections, and there's descriptions of the many, many types of each one of these issues that you might have. So DSM is periodically revised to reflect new research and understanding of mental health. The most recent DSM-5 edition, DSM-5, was published in 2013. Mental health professionals use DSM to diagnose patients and guide treatment planning, all right? Because that's part of research, is that, you kind of look up what is the diagnosis, and each diagnosis, there's recommendations for treatment, right? Yeah. Now, the problem is that most people, so if you have, a trauma spectrum disorder, okay, there's very few in DSM. There's very, very few diagnoses. PTSD is in there. Very few, but complex PTSD isn't in there, right? Dissociation disorders are in a totally different category, right? And if you meet, if people, until recently, so like most psychiatrists, wasn't trauma, PTSD wasn't even their radar. It's more in the last 10 years that it's one of those diagnoses that we are beginning to make. But before, most people who had trauma were diagnosed with depression. Of course, people who have trauma are going to be depressed, and they're going to fit the criterion for depression. And a lot of people who have trauma also fit the criteria for anxiety disorders. So they were diagnosed with anxiety disorders and with depression, but they were never diagnosed with trauma, right? Because part of that has to do with our psychiatric interviews, because they're very short. And, most psychiatric interviews are like an hour, and you go through a symptom list, but you never get to the point where you ask people about, what their lived experience was like, what their childhood was like. So then you're going to miss a lot of attachment issues, miss a lot of trauma. Yeah, I mean, I was I worked for the College of Physicians and Surgeons for about 15 years. I did peer assessments. And so what a peer assessor does, they go into somebody's practice and they look at, the quality of their practice and give people feedback and stuff. And so you look at their histories, you look at their treatment plans, and it's pretty common that, most histories don't look at, your developmental history. It's mostly based on symptoms. Do you fit these symptoms? That's DSM, right? until recently, and I know the new generation of psychiatrists, they're doing a much better job of considering trauma. But until recently, it was kind of not on our radar so much. Okay. So researchers use DSM criteria to define study populations and ensure consistency in research on mental health. So, what that means is that, so if you're doing a study on antidepressants, you want to make sure the people that are in your study fit the criteria for depression, right? But the really interesting thing, is that if you're doing research, and a lot of research is done by the pharmaceutical companies, they sponsor it. So it's not done independently by universities or whatever. So they do cherry pick, because we also know the people that are less likely to respond to antidepressants. So if you have somebody who has trauma or attachment issues, right, they're less likely. So they more likely to have long-standing problems, less likely to respond to antidepressants. So often those are exclusion criteria. And what they're focusing on are people that have, acute depression. So they've been coping well all their life. All of a sudden, they get depressed because maybe overwhelming circumstances, a lot of stress. Okay. And so those are the people that get entered into medication trials. Okay. But even when you cherry pick, the results, like the active ingredients or the medication, antidepressants, are not a lot better than placebo. Okay, so yeah, they do work very well for some people, but other people, they just don't work. And a lot of people that we're giving antidepressants to, they're not going to respond because they do have a lot of, chronic issues, trauma, attachment issues. Okay. DSM is also often used to determine coverage for mental health services by insurance companies. Okay. And up until 10 years ago, if you're doing a form for an insurance company and it's going to get accepted, you have to write major depression, or you have to have bipolar disorder, or psychotic disorder. If I wrote 10 years ago, if I wrote post-traumatic stress disorder, it would come back and say, well, that's not doesn't make this person eligible. So, because they're looking at this stuff. Now it's a bit better, right? So we can write PTSD and clarify, and that's acceptable to the insurance companies. So while the DSM is widely used, it has faced criticism for various reasons. Some people argue that DSM reflects Western cultural norms, may not be applicable to all cultural contexts. Critics suggest that DSM sometimes pathologizes normal variations in behavior or mood. DSM primarily relies on symptom-based criteria and random biological markers, which can lead to subjective interpretations. Okay, so let's very quickly, before we take our break, let's look at the DSM section on personality disorders, because of all the sections, this one's the most controversial one. It's the one that's, people kind of, they cringe when they think about it, all right? So the section on personality disorders in DSM outlines enduring patterns of behavior, cognition, and inner experience that deviate markedly from the expectations of an individual culture. Okay, this is all definition taken from DSM. These patterns are pervasive, meaning like long-lasting, right? Inflexible, stable over time, and lead to distress or impairment. Each personality disorder has specific diagnostic criteria, and diagnosis typically requires a comprehensive clinical assessment. It's important to note that personality disorders can vary in severity and may present differently in different individuals. The DSM-5, the latest edition, categorizes personality disorders into 3 clusters. And that's been the case since DSM-3. So the first cluster is called Cluster A. And this, like you get into, this sounds very judgmental, right? And I kind of almost hesitate to mention it. This is taken from DSM, right? It's not me. So Cluster A is odd or eccentric disorders. And there's 3 different disorders in cluster A. So there's paranoid personality disorder, characterized by pervasive distrust and suspicion of others, interpreting motives as malevolent. Okay, not trusting. People are out to get me. Okay. 2, schizoid personality disorder, marked by detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression. And 3, schizotypal personality disorder, involves acute discomfort in close relationships, cognitive or perceptual distortions, and eccentric behavior. And if you look at that, I look at that and I go, wow, I have features of all of those. And if somebody has trauma, who's not, if you have trauma, you're going to have like features of each one of those, right? Also. So, yeah. And then there's cluster A, which is the odd and eccentric. And then there's cluster B, which is the most commonly diagnosed, which is dramatic, emotional, or erratic disorders. Again, like these are not my terms. This is like taken from DSM. And when you read it, maybe you're feeling already a little bit of the judgment in the language. So there's 4 different personality disorders in cluster B. So the first one is antisocial personality disorder, features a disregard for and violation of the rights of others, lack of empathy, deceitfulness, and impulsivity. Then you have borderline personality disorder, characterized by instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affect, so mood, along with marked impulsivity. Then you have histrionic personality disorder, involves excessive emotionality and attention-seeking behavior. It sounds so judgmental, right? Do you get the same sense that I do? Yeah. Okay. And then narcissistic personality disorder, marked by grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. And I think I react because, there's 2 poles. You can judge or you can understand. Okay. And these diagnoses are much more, they sound a little bit judgmental. I don't think they're meant to be, but they sound judgmental, that this is what you are. I think, the approach of this course is much more about understanding why people have some of these features, right? Rather than kind of saying, judging that you have this. It's like, okay, so you have some of these features, but, okay, why? And finally, cluster C is the anxious or fearful disorder. So you have avoidant personality disorder characterized by social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. Dependent personality involves a pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of, leading to submissive and clinging behaviors. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder marked by a preoccupation with orderliness, perfection, and control at the expense of flexibility and efficacy. Okay, again, so I'm going to stop after this slide, and we'll take a break. But by far, the most commonly diagnosed personality disorder, so you might have heard of some of those other ones, but the one that probably, like, I would say 70 to 80% of the personality disorder diagnosis are borderline personality disorder by psychiatrists. All the other ones, like maybe 20%, right? So by far the most common diagnosed personality disorder is borderline personality disorder. Several reasons have been suggested for this. So BPD is characterized by symptoms that can be quite pronounced and disruptive. These symptoms often lead individuals to seek help, resulting in a higher rate of diagnosis. Other people might not seek help quite as much. The symptoms of BPD can significantly impact a person's daily functioning and quality of life, leading to frequent interactions with mental health services. This can increase the likelihood of diagnosis as individuals seek treatment for their difficulties. Over the years, there has been increased awareness and understanding of BPD among mental health professionals. This has led to more accurate identification and diagnosis of the disorder. And BPD often co-occurs with other mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder. This comorbidity can lead to more frequent interactions with healthcare providers, increasing the chances of the diagnosis. The criteria for diagnosing BPD are well defined in diagnostic manuals like DSM-5, which aids clinicians in identifying the disorder. When we talk about trauma, we're going to talk a lot more about this. We're going to talk about the overlap between BPD and complex PTSD and other diagnoses as well. Okay, so I think let's take a break there for 10 minutes. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about criticisms of DSM personality disorder. And Lauren, if you can just pause the. Okay, I think that's where we were. Okay, so let's look at, I'll just go quickly over this because these are some of the criticisms that have been aimed at this section on personality disorders in DSM. So DSM classification of personality disorders has faced several criticisms over the years. So one is categorical versus dimensional approach. The DSM uses a categorical approach, meaning it classifies personality disorders as distinct entities. So either you have this or you don't, right? There's no kind of, you have a little bit of it, right? Like you can't be a little bit pregnant, either you are, that's like the way it uses the personality disorders. Critics argue that personality traits exist on a continuum, and a dimensional approach would better capture the nuances and variations in personality pathology. So we can all have a little bit of paranoid personality. We can all have a little bit of schizoid personality, but like to be diagnosed with it, right? But we all have little traits of this. Overlap and comorbidity. There's significant overlap among the diagnostic criteria for different personality disorders, leading to high rates of comorbidity, meaning you have more than one. You fit the criteria for one and the other, you might have like 3 different personality disorders. How does that make any sense, right? This can make it difficult to distinguish between disorders and may result in multiple diagnoses for the same individual. So sometimes you have, like people take several medications, psychiatric medications. Sometimes they have multiple diagnoses as well. It's so confusing, right? Cultural biases. DSM criteria are based largely on Western cultural norms, which may not be applicable or relevant to individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds. This can lead to misdiagnosis or misunderstanding of culturally specific behaviors. So I grew up in Portugal, and Portuguese people are much more impressionistic and emotional. They probably meet a lot of criterion for some personality disorders, right? But that's a cultural thing, so looking at you, right? So I can say that because I'm Portuguese. So cultural stigmatization. The labeling of individuals with personality disorders can contribute to stigma and may affect how they are perceived by others, including healthcare providers. This can impact the quality of care and the individual's willingness to seek treatment. Yeah, that's kind of, I think maybe it's changing a little bit, but sometimes, people come into the emergency room for, some physical thing, and, you look at their chart and you can go, oh, this person has been labeled with personality disorder, and kind of then that colors a lot of the care they might receive in the emergency room, right? Lack of empirical support. Some critics argue that certain personality disorders lack robust empirical support and that the criterion can be somewhat arbitrary. I think more than somewhat, they're very arbitrary. This raises concerns about the validity and reliability of diagnosis. Gender bias. Certain personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, are diagnosed more frequently in women, leading to concerns about gender bias in the criteria and diagnostic process. Stability over time. DSM suggests that personality disorders are stable over time, but research indicates that symptoms can change and even remit, challenging the notion of their permanence. So you see this a lot, right? It does change, right? And focus on pathology. The DSM focuses on pathological aspects of personality, potentially neglecting the strengths and adaptive traits that individuals with personality disorders may possess. So these criticisms have led to ongoing debates and discussions in the mental health field, and they have influenced revisions and updates to the DSM over time. But I think the best criticism of DSM is from Bessel van de Kolk. So Bessel van der Kolk, I have two, like I have a lot of personal, not a lot, like I have a few personal mentors that really shape my thinking about psychiatry. But Bessel van der Kolk, I've attended conferences that he's given. I've never spoken to him, but he's kind of one of my psychiatric heroes. He's a Dutch American psychiatrist who started working in Veterans Administration in the 70s, I think, late 60s, early 70s. So he's working with a lot of traumatized veterans from the Vietnam War. So he was really into trauma early on. And he's also a researcher, but he's been sort of a force in research and treatment of trauma. And he has very little respect for DSM, as you can see, and he says, one of the things that he says that I really like is, DSM is 943 pages or something. He says, if you take trauma out of the DSM, you're left with a pamphlet. So he thinks everything is, like, so much of it is trauma. Obviously not everything, but a lot of it is. Okay, so much for classification, which we've been talking about. Are there theories that try to explain personality? So, we've classified it, but how do you explain, like, that people have different personalities? So there's 4 major personality theories. I'm not going to go into 3 of them in detail. We are going to go in a great deal of detail into one of them, which is the psychodynamic theory. So we're going to spend most of my time, because that's the one I prefer, and I think makes a lot of sense. But that's not to say that the other ones aren't important and don't help our understanding as well. So I'm just going to touch on them, but I'm not going to go into them. So this is about, when we talk about personality theories, we're talking about trying to understand the mind and trying to understand what it is to be human. And over the past 2 centuries, our dominant way of understanding the mind has swung or shifted through different perspectives. Right? So it hasn't been just one perspective. In the late 19th and early 20th century, psychodynamic theory, which kind of owes a lot to Freud, emphasized the power of unconscious drives and inner conflicts. By the mid-20th century, behaviorism shifted attention from the psychodynamic, the unconscious, to observable actions and conditioning, while later decades highlighted biology, the brain, and genetics as central to mental life. So it's interesting that I did my training at McGill, and I started training in psychiatry 1985. Okay, so I finished medical school 1985, started training in psychiatry. And it's interesting because that was just before biological psychiatry took over. And McGill, there had been a lot of immigrants from Europe who relocated to Montreal. And McGill was kind of like a bastion of psychodynamic psychotherapy. And so it was very Freudian in those days, which is like, nowadays it's unheard of. But a lot of my training was kind of, psychodynamics. There's Freud, right? And going through residency, we had a little bit about medication, but that was before Prozac came out. We only had a few medications. Prozac came out in 1989. That's when I was finishing my residency, right? Before that, we had a few medications which were pretty useful, but the pharmaceutical industry hadn't become, the behemoth that it is now. It was smaller. So in this course, we recognize that each of these perspectives that I'm going to talk about, biological, the different theories, each of these perspectives has something valuable to offer. Rather than choosing one over another, we think that the human experience is best understood, again, because they're all maps, and you can, you're looking at the territory, and, one map helps you understand some aspects of the territory. Another map helps you understand other aspects, right? Now, you might have one map that you prefer because you find, you're more familiar, more comfortable with it. It's not to say that other maps aren't, helpful as well. Okay. We think that human experience best understood through a both and rather than either or lens. This is the essence of the biopsychosocial spiritual model, which we talk about in this course, which weaves together biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions into a more complete picture of mind and health. All these different perspectives are different ways of trying to understand how the world interacts with us and how through that interaction, our personality is shaped into like a unique personality for each one of us. Okay, so let me just briefly touch on the 4 major personality theories. And you can see there that there's psychodynamic trait, behavioral and social cognitive, and humanistic theories. So the psychodynamic theory is the one that we're going to spend the rest of the course talking about and developing to help us to understand ourselves. Okay? And I think you're going to find that it's very helpful. So under the psychodynamic theory, people are viewed as struggling between their animal instincts and the pressures of socialization. So we talked about instincts already, right? So we have those instincts. That's part of our, we're going to talk about in a second, our id, our impulses, right? But we also have this other part of us that, well, we can't just let our impulses kind of come out no matter what, right? So we try to kind of, there's a little bit of a battle in there, right? The emphasis in psychodynamic theory is on childhood experiences and the unconscious mind, right? Because, what happens to us, attachment and trauma throughout life, but also in childhood, it affects how our instincts develop. It changes our instincts, right? For instance, if, we talked about having fight or flight instinct, right? And if you have a lot of trauma, your fight or flight instinct is going to be pretty revved up. And if you don't have attachment, your attachment instinct is going to be underdeveloped, right? And that's going to affect your personality. So this psychodynamic theory looks at instincts and, the inner battle between instincts and so our emotions, what we feel, and our desire to control, rational mind, emotional mind, rational mind. The other theories that we're not going to talk about, but I just want to mention for, to be complete, is personality trait theory. People are viewed under this theory, people are viewed as exhibiting consistent psychological traits such as introversion, neuroticism, agreeableness. That's the big 5, right? The emphasis in trait theory is on identifying, describing, and measuring personality traits. Some of the major contributors to this theory were Gordon Allport and Hans Eysenck. We're not going to go more detail into that. Then you have humanistic personality theories. People are viewed under humanistic personality theories as seeking personal growth and striving towards becoming their full selves. The emphasis in humanistic theory is on psychological growth, free will, and personal awareness. Major contributors to this theory were Maslow and Rogers. We're going to talk about Maslow in a little bit, okay? Not today, but in a few weeks, we're going to talk about Maslow. So we touch on humanistic personality theory a little bit. And then social and cognitive personality theory. In this theory, people are viewed as behaving according to how they cope with social pressures and solve social challenges. The emphasis in social cognitive theory is on observational learning, self-efficacy, and situational influences. Major contributors to this theory were Bandura, Kelly, and Walter. And we do kind of interweave that theory into our course, right? But we don't talk about it directly. So each of these theories contributes something important to our understanding of personality. Each is a valuable map of the territory. In this course, we will, however, focus on psychodynamic theory. Okay, so having talked about psychodynamic theory and just briefly mentioned it, let's go a little bit more in detail into it. So what is psychodynamic personality theory? And that's a little toy doll of Freud. I have that in my office. People have been there, see that? So dynamics, because psychodynamics, right? It's part of the word, generally refers to the forces or processes that stimulate growth, change, or development within a system. That system is us. So what are the forces in us that shape, our growth and development? right? We touched briefly on those. Psychodynamics is a study of the interrelation between the conscious and unconscious processes that influence human personality. It is a concept rooted in psychoanalytical theory, so Freud, originally developed by Sigmund Freud, which explores how internal drives, desires, and conflicts shape an individual's personality and actions. Psychodynamics involves examining past experiences, internal conflicts, and the influence of early relationships to understand and address psychological issues. Okay? So it's important to understand the past because it shapes our emotional mind, right? And our emotional mind is very, very important. So Freud came up with a lot of different theories, but you can kind of group them into two major areas. So he had theories about what the structure of personality is. We're going to talk about in a minute, okay? And also how this personality developed. And I think the his theory of the structure of personality is still very relevant today. I think his theory of how personality developed, and he talked about the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. I think nobody talks about that anymore. It's kind of, there's other better theories. We're going to talk about Erikson has a better theory of personality development. So we're not going to talk about Freud's theory of personality development. Okay. So Freud started this lineage called psychodynamic personality theory, right? And it kind of since his time, it's been 150 years, kind of evolved in two different directions. So one is called eco-psychology. And eco-psychology has a lot to offer. We're not going to go into it, right? Because there's so much to explore. In a course like this, we can only kind of talk about so much. But ego-psychology is rooted in the concepts of id, superego, and ego. It focuses on the normal and pathological developments of personality and how id and instinctual impulses are managed. We'll skip over this today, but there are slides on it if you'd like a briefer overview. So I'm not going to go into those slides, but if you want to just kind of read a little bit about it, go to the website and look at the slides from today. The one thing we will focus more on in the course is called object relations. And object relations considers that the processes of developing personality, so how your personality develops, right, occurs in relation to other people. So attachment, right? How your parents parent you, whether you're traumatized, right? Attachment theory is the most researched and validated offshoot of object relations, and it is one of the theories that we're going to talk about in a great deal of detail because it's so important in shaping our personality. So let's talk a little bit about the structure, Freud's theory of the structure of personality. And a good way to understand it is to think about his iceberg model, okay? And the idea is that an iceberg, because it's made of ice, and ice is a little bit lighter than water, the iceberg floats, right? But the density of ice is almost the same as the density of water, just a little bit less. And so what you get is it's only the little tip of the iceberg that sticks out of the water, right? So if there's a little bit of iceberg sticking out of the water, you can count on that there's like great big chunk of ice underneath the surface. You're only seeing the little tip, okay? So this metaphor was used by Freud because he said, you know what? The conscious mind is like the little tip of the iceberg that's sticking out of the water. And the conscious mind is the part of the mind that we're aware of, that we can see, okay? That we can hear, we can see, that we're aware of. But if you're aware of only like a little part, it's easy to believe that that's all there is. We can't see the unconscious. There's an intermediate layer, which is called the subconscious. Subconscious is like, just below the water, you can still see a little bit of the iceberg because water penetrates. But if you go deep enough, you really can't see, the ice that's deeper. So there's the subconscious, and then there's the unconscious, which is like deeper. But most of us, and most of what shapes how we think, how we feel, and how we behave is unconscious. Now, we do our best to try to justify and to explain how we feel, we think, and we behave, but we're wrong, right? Because we're just not aware. And we come up with a tentative explanation. But when you kind of explore the deeper layers of your mind, you kind of realize that, yeah, that wasn't a good explanation. I was trying to come up with, I had to come up with something, right? But when you explore this, you kind of go, oh, okay, that's why I behave and I think and I feel this way, right? So that's what we're going to discover in this course, because we're going to discover, our personalities, but our personality owes a lot to the unconscious, what's submerged, okay? So Freud talked about, 3 levels, which is the conscious, the part of the iceberg outside the water, the subconscious or preconscious, which is you're not aware of, but with a little help, right, it can come to the surface. And then there's the unconscious. It's deeper, harder to access. And you have to kind of really do a lot of digging and, scuba diving to become more familiar with it. So he talked about, those 3 layers, but he also talked about 3 different parts of the mind. He called them the id, the superego, and the ego, all right? And the id is very much like emotional mind. So the instinctual id, so it's instinctual, right, is the most primitive part of the psyche. It's present from birth and encompasses all basic instincts we talked about, drives such as hunger, thirst, sexual desire. The id seeks immediate gratification because when you have these needs, you kind of, okay, just want to kind of satisfy those needs, right? The id is impulsive, demanding instant satisfaction without considering consequences or social norms. It is associated with our unconscious desires and urges, and the id corresponds to emotional mind. So we have this force, which is, our desires. Freud called it the id. It's our impulses. It owes to our instincts, okay? So that's one part. The other part that is kind of, they're a little bit in combat with each other, is the rational mind, the rational superego. And the superego represents internalized societal norms, values, and moral standards. So we learn how to behave. Kids, when they come to the world, they don't know, right? But we learn, these are the ways you behave. This, you don't do this, you do this. You don't, there's norms to follow, right? So, but now you have kind of your superego tells you this is what to do, and you have your ego who wants different things, and these two are a little bit in opposition. Because sometimes we want things, but we can't have them because it's not right. Right? Society tells us like, oh, don't do that. Right? Imagine that you just followed your desires. That's why we have laws and stuff, right? Laws are part of the superego. Okay? And then what Freud said as well is that you have a third part of the mind, which he called the ego, which in this course we call it's closest to the self-observing or wise mind. And the ego develops as a person matures and learns to live in the world. It seeks to satisfy its desires in realistic and socially appropriate ways. So it's kind of a mediator between, the id and the superego, right? Because you can be more led by your id, the emotional mind. So then you kind of just pursue your desires without regard to consequences, right? You're driven by your impulses, right? That can result in trouble. Or you can be much more dominated by your superego. Then you're very rigid. You don't do anything, you don't follow your id at all. You don't do what you want. You just do what you're supposed to, okay? But if you have a good balance between the two, that's the role of the ego, is kind of says, okay, you can, I know you have this desire, right? You want to eat, right? You're hungry, but you have to stand in line at circle, right? Don't just kind of cut up in front. Now, there's some people that will cut in front, right? That's like maybe either they're very hungry or they can't control their id, right? They haven't learned the, superego. They haven't learned the rules, right? So you can see that there's a balance between them. Okay, the ego mediates between the id's demands and the constraints of reality, helping to make decisions and solve problems. It is responsible for rational thinking, planning, and self-control. So that's what Freud talked about. That's the basic, that said, this is the structure of the mind. We have different layers. We also have different components that are conflict with each other. The id, the superego, and then you have the ego is trying to kind of balance the two so that, we get through the world in an okay way. All right. So the interaction between the id, superego, and ego, or emotional, rational, and wise mind, creates a dynamic system that influences behavior. For example, when the id desires something immediately, like food, the ego must find a way to satisfy that desire within the constraints of reality and the moral guidelines set by the superego. Meaning you just don't kind of go into a restaurant and steal the food, or cut in line at Circle, right? Or eat with your hands like at a fancy restaurant, right? So the ego is trying to kind of balance this, right? Conflicts among these three, id, superego, and ego, are mostly between the id and superego, can lead to anxiety, depression, and other forms of psychological distress. So, in psychiatry, one of the things that you learn, there's, this is also like a thing in I don't know if you've heard in dermatology. When I did my rotation dermatology, they said, well, all you need to know about dermatology is if it's wet, dry it, and if it's dry, wet it. That's all you need to know. Okay. I don't know if you've heard that before, but in psychiatry, we have something similar, which is, if there's too much id and somebody's too loose, you have to tighten them. Okay. And if somebody's too tight, they have too much superego, you have to loosen them. And that's kind of the equivalent in psychiatry, okay? Which means like you have to aim for the middle, like help them with the ego, right? That the ego negotiates things a little bit better. All right. So Freud's structural theory proposes a framework for understanding the complexity of human behavior and personality. It emphasizes the internal conflicts that can arise from competing desires and moral standards, laying the groundwork for many concepts in psychology and psychotherapy. Okay, that's a brief introduction to Freud's theory. Now, I just made this slide up this morning. I woke up at 2 a.m. I said, because I cut a lot. I went back to sleep after, right? Yeah. But that happens sometimes. Because I cut a lot of slides, and one of my favorite theorists is Carl Jung. So I prefer Jung to Freud. But I cut out all the Jung from this presentation because we just had too many slides. So I thought, no, I have to put Jung back, right? So I thought, okay, I have to come up with this slide. So this is a little bit about Freud and Jung. And so, see, the thing is that Freud and Jung had a lot of similarities. They both had psychodynamics, so dynamics of the mind, different parts of the mind, and they were both what's called depth psychologists. And depth psychologists means they consider there's an unconscious, that people are deep, and that you can't just go with what's at the surface, the tip of the iceberg. So they had a lot of similarities. Now, Freud was about 19 years older than Jung, right? But they were contemporaries. So both Freud and Jung developed psychodynamic and depth psychologies. They first met in 1907, and their first conversation, the first time they met, lasted for 13 hours. There's a lot of books written about that conversation. And they were both electrified by the connection that they had in that conversation. Imagine talking to somebody for 13 hours. And there were all these weird things that happen called synchronicities at this meeting. Okay, don't have time to go into that, but if you ask me a question, I can go a little bit more into it. So in the early years, Freud and Jung were close. Freud even called Jung his crown prince. Part of this was that, psychoanalysis was considered, Freud was Jewish from Vienna. He was an atheist, so he didn't believe in God, but culturally he was Jewish. And in those days, like all the psychoanalysts were Jewish as well. So psychoanalysis is known as the Jewish science. for a long time. Now, Jung was Protestant from Switzerland, and Freud saw this as, we need to kind of break out of our little circle. And he saw Jung, who was brilliant, as he's the person who's going to bring this outside of our small Jewish circles in Vienna, because that was the epicenter. He had trouble breaking out, right, of Vienna. So in the early years, they were close. Freud, okay. And he thought that Jung was going to be the leader of psychoanalysis. But in 1913, their relationship ended because Jung rejected Freud's belief that sexuality is the primary driver of the psyche. Okay. Freud saw the mind as a battleground of instincts against morality, so id versus superego, while Jung saw the mind as a journey towards wholeness, shaped not only by personal experiences, but by a deeper shared human psyche, which he called the collective unconscious. I'm going to go into that in 1 second. So Freud thought Jung's ideas, which included concepts of archetypes, spirituality, and the collective unconscious, which these are very spiritual concepts, okay, were too mystical and a threat to psychoanalysis' scientific credibility. Because in those days, it was important for psychology to be scientific. And, Freud thought, oh, no, there he goes. He's lost it. He's kind of gone spiritual. It's not good. So Jung wanted depth psychology to include mythology, religion, and meaning. Freud wanted a medical, drive-based model. And what happened was that they broke up, right? They had a big falling out. And the breakup was intense and personal. Jung later said, to me, Freud was like a father. And largely as a result of this breakup, Jung was ill for 5 years. He actually had psychotic symptoms, and he was very unwell for 5 years. But the thing was that during that time, he introspected, and it really advanced his theory. So he found out a lot. He transformed this illness into a creative endeavor, right? All right. So that's a picture of Freud and Jung. And just to contrast a little bit their different approaches. So we talked about Freud, the main structure of the mind. He talked about the id, ego, and superego, conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. Jung's close, but he talked about the ego, personal unconscious, collective unconscious. Tell you what the collective unconscious is in a minute. What drives behavior? For Freud, it was the biological drives, especially sexuality and aggression. So he wasn't talking about trauma. He wasn't talking about attachment, because those concepts hadn't been thought of yet, right? But psychodynamic psychotherapy has incorporated those concepts into their theory since then. Jung was talking about, he said what drove behavior was our desire for growth, meaning, and psychological wholeness. He called that individuation. In unconscious contents. So Freud thought what's unconscious, repressed wishes and forbidden impulses, so the id. Whereas Jung thought includes personal material, so forbidden wishes, repressed wishes, whatever. But he also talked about inherited universal patterns, archetypes, right? And the goal of development of therapy for Freud was to reduce inner conflict and make unconscious impulses conscious so the ego can manage them. So that's what he did, is like try to bring the unconscious into consciousness, what's driving your behavior, so then the ego can kind of deal with it. But for Jung, the goal of development and therapy was to help the person integrate unconscious parts and connect to deeper meaning and purpose. All right? So I'm going to skip over this. That's a little bit about ego psychology, which I told you there's, the object relations part of psychodynamic theory, and then there's the ego psychology. I'm not going to touch a lot on ego psychology, which is interesting. We're going to focus on the object relations. Object relations, it's kind of a weird term, but what it means is like relating to other people. So they call other people objects? I don't know. That's what it's called. So I'm going to skip over that. Okay. So far we talked a little bit about we said Freud came up with two theories, which was one was the structure of personality, right? Or of mind. So we talked about the id, superego, and ego. That's structural theory. And the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, that's structural theory, how the mind is shaped. The other thing that he talked about was, well, okay, that's how it's shaped. How does it develop? So we need a theory about how it develops. And that's what, we're not going to look a lot at Freud because he talked about those, the oral stage and phallic stage. And I tried looking into it and kind of learned it a little bit at one point, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me, to be honest. Okay. Maybe just, I didn't get deep enough. What made sense was Erikson's theory. So most theories agree that two factors are critical in the development of personality. They, however, differ as to the relative importance of these two factors. So what are two factors that are really important in the formation of personality? So one of them is called nature. Okay. So nature refers to what is innate to the individual at birth. Okay. So it's like how you come into the world from the get-go. That's called nature. Okay. Who you are, because you're already, every little baby that comes into the world, it's going to be very different. Okay. The other factor that really important in shaping personality is what's called nurture. So nurture is what is learned and due to the environment or circumstances after birth. It's kind of an arbitrary distinction, but we always talk, you must have heard about nature and nurture. That's what it's about. So personality development theories range on the spectrum from seeing children as, when they come into the world, some people say, a child is a blank slate. There's nothing there. And what happens is that how their personality develops is totally influenced by by nurture. So they're blank slates, and what shapes personality is their experiences. So that's one camp, okay, that we're blank slates. There's nothing at birth, just kind of, like a blank slate to be written on. Nothing is written there. And what writes what we are is our experience. And two, destined by their nature or temperament to develop a certain personality. So other people say that from the get-go, the way you are is going to be so influential already. So you can, depending on a child's temperament, what they're like from very beginning, from birth, is so influential into how their personality develops. Okay, so there's these two camps. One is that you're blank, there's nothing at birth, and the other one is that everything is already written from how you come into the world. Okay, and 2A is human nature or temperament is predominantly selfish. So so this is a subsection of what is people's temperament like, or baby's temperament. So some people say baby's temperament predominantly selfish and must be restrained and civilized by society through proper upbringing. This was a view put forward by 16th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Okay, so some people say, yeah, from the get-go, it's determined, but you're selfish from the get-go. So, you got to have like super ego. You got to learn the rules. You got to enforce the rules. That's a very conservative view, right? Or, so some of the people that say that temperament is really important. So from the get-go, there's a lot of things that are determined, but they say human nature temperament is fundamentally good, only to be corrupted by upbringing. So one says that upbringing has to like constrain the ego. Another one says like people are like great from the beginning, but they're ruined by society. All right. This view was put forward by 18th century Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And that's like more of a liberal view. Okay. So today, most experts recognize that the importance of both nature and nurture and see children as going through stages of personality development. At each stage, the child's temperament interacts with their environment. So what happens to them? So it's a combination of nature and nurture in complex ways. During psychosocial development, children face challenges that they must negotiate before proceeding to the next developmental stage. And this is anticipating what Erikson is saying. How well they progress through these psychosocial stages is critical to development of their personality. Okay, and so this is Erikson's theory of personality development, which is the one that I think makes the most sense to me. So one theory of personality development that has stood the test of time is Erik Erikson's. Erik Erikson was a German-American developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst. Erikson coined the phrase identity crisis, and he described 8 critical stages of personality development. And so it's almost like as you go through life, these are critical stages that you can identify people as going through, from babyhood till old age. And he identified, and these make a lot of sense. So he said, the first stage of development, personality development, is trust versus mistrust, right? This is attachment. So little baby, what they're learning is they're learning whether the world is trustworthy or not. So if they have parents who are trustworthy, who are emotionally present, attentive, and appropriately responsive, what are they going to learn? They're going to learn, the world is a trustworthy place. Okay, that's the first stage. Okay? But if there's attachment issues, so if the parents aren't trustworthy, they're going to have trouble negotiating that first stage of personality development, right? Because remember, personality development, we're heading towards a healthy personality. And if you have attachment issues, so that you can't trust your parents, it hinders your personality development. It makes it difficult for your personality to develop because you haven't established this trust that you need in the world to develop healthy personality. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, this is the ideal case. So a kid that has parents that are dependable, available, emotionally present, right? So first stage, trust, right? They've achieved trust. What's next? All right. The next stage happens at around ages 1 to 3, right? And it's called, Erikson called it autonomy versus shame and doubt. So what happens ages 1 to 3 is the terrible twos. And what happens in the terrible twos? Well, kids are establishing autonomy. They're saying no, right? So they're establishing, I'm separate from you, right? But you can't say I'm separate from you if there's not trust to begin with. So actually saying no, establishing autonomy, kid who says no, that's very healthy. They're going through that stage. Now, if they fail going through that stage, then what happens is that the kids, if they can't, they haven't negotiated trust, right? They can't negotiate autonomy, right? Because they can't trust. If you can't trust, you can't fully say no, right? And it's going to be hard to become independent, right? So that's where, these kids develop a lot of shame and doubt, right? Shame and doubt about becoming their own person, becoming autonomous, right? So the beginning, so this is personality formation, but what you see is that it becomes hard to say no. It becomes hard to become your own person, right? And so each of these stages occurs at a different age. So then you have initiative versus guilt. So what happens, this is in preschoolers, okay? And what is that about, initiative versus guilt? So if you have a parent that's attuned and you trust that parent and you said no to them, okay, the next stage is that now you have to become competent at doing things, right? But that can go wrong because either, parents can do everything for you, right? So you never learn initiative. You never learn to do your own thing, to kind of go out in the world and try to solve your own problems, right? Or they can say everything you do is wrong, right? So you're going, oh, I can't do anything. So they do everything for you, or they tell you you can't do it. So again, that's going to make it difficult for you to learn that, how I get ahead in the world is by taking initiative, by being an agent, by doing things, and I'm a competent person, right? Because little kids, so this happens with a lot of parents, is that obviously like what is very easy for an adult can be very hard for a little kid because they're not at the same developmental stage. And some parents are not attuned. They kind of look at their kids, oh, you can't do anything. Of course not, right? Because you're a little kid, but you have to allow them to do it, at their own level, right? But some parents are like clued out. It's like, oh, this kid can't do anything. Now if that's consistent, that has very negative consequences for personality development because you learn you can't do anything. Okay. So that I relate a lot to that because I had to learn as an adult that I was competent, right? Didn't think I was as a kid. All right. So, all right. So then, and this one, for example, initiative versus guilt, a lot of people that have what is called a outer locus of control, they feel that they have no say in what happens to them. It's because they have problems with initiative versus guilt. If you have an inner locus of control, you can say, no, I'm a competent person and I can't control everything, but what I do matters to my life. So I have to go out there. So a lot of these issues can be related to stages of personality development. Industry versus inferiority. So that happens 7 to 11 years old. And that's when kids learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks. And if they don't, they feel inferior. Okay. So at this age, it's about persistence and hanging in there and enjoying that, hey, you're competent, right? And then you have later on teenagers, 12 to 18, because before that, you don't really have, if you think back to your teenage years, you're really kind of a part of your parents. You're not very distinct. But 12 to 18, you start to form your identity. I'm a different person. That's when you distance yourself even more from your parents. And you start to kind of, what's my identity? So teenagers work at refining a sense of self by testing roles and then integrating them to form a single identity, or they become confused about who they are. Okay. And then young adults, the task that they have, 19 to 29, intimacy versus isolation. So before that age, you can be intimate with family members, grandparents and parents, but you also have to learn to become intimate with others, right? With a partner, right? Now, if you never establish trust, you might have a semblance of intimacy, but you're not going to feel it, right? So you can kind of fake all these things, and it's okay faking, right? A lot of us do that. So that's 19 to 29. This is like a very rich theory. I can't do justice to it. I mean, we could talk about this for a whole session or more, right? But I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what it is. Then ages 30 to 64. So that's like our age, right? I'm older than that. I'm 65. But so where you're at, stage development is generativity versus stagnation. So the middle-aged discover a sense of contributing to the world, usually through family and work, or they may feel a lack of purpose. Okay, so it's not longer just about yourself, it's about giving. Okay, that becomes important. If you're older and it's all about yourself, something went wrong with your personality development. Okay, and it's going to be hard to be happy if it's just about yourself, right? Because if you can get pleasure and satisfaction from contributing to the world, that's huge, right? And the last stage of development that Erikson described was integrity versus despair. So integrity versus despair is like older adults, okay? When reflecting on their life, the older adults may feel a sense of satisfaction or failure. And so typical statements that you hear from people is, if somebody who had integrity, because that's the final stage, you have to kind of develop through the other stages, right? They kind of go, wow, that was great. You know, like I lived like fully. That was wonderful, right? And, you know I'm going to die, next little while, but that was like amazing. Okay. That's integrity. And somebody who's in despair, they kind of say, is that it? That's it? Is that all there is? It's like, my God, that was horrible, right? All right. So each of Erickson's 8 stages is a building block that is crucial to healthy maturation. If a stage is not successfully negotiated, it impairs further personality development. If, for example, a toddler is unable to trust his parental figures, he won't be able to move to a stage of autonomy in which she begins to do things for herself and say no to help from the parent. Autonomy is commonly referred to as a terrible twos. The toddler that does not achieve autonomy, rather than happily doing things for themselves, will instead experience shame and self-doubt, feelings which will continue to impact her development as she tries, but now with a significant psychological handicap, to move through the subsequent stages of development. So what are some of the factors that affect psychosocial development? So what are some of the things that help you to progress through those stages successfully, those Ericksonian stages, versus what kind of sets you back? So there's a number of things. So psychosocial development is influenced by a variety of factors that can either promote or hinder that psychosocial development. Some key influences on development include family environment, so attachment, supportive and nurturing family dynamics promote healthy development, while conflict, neglect, or abuse can hinder healthy personality development. Okay? Because we're talking about, personality development. This is what this course is about, right? So socioeconomic status. Access to resources, education, and healthcare can enhance development, whereas poverty and lack of access can create barriers. None of these factors is determinate, but they all contribute. The parental thing is pretty important. Cultural influences. Cultural norms and values shape identity and social behaviors, providing a framework for development. However, cultural conflicts or discrimination can be detrimental. Educational and learning opportunities. Quality education and opportunities for learning encourage cognitive and social growth. Conversely, limited educational opportunities can restrict development. Neurodivergences. Differences in attention, emotion, or social interaction create mismatches with environmental expectations, making it harder to master developmental tasks at each stage. So if you're neurodivergent, it's harder to go through these stages because it's kind of like a little bit of a handicap. And society is most friendly to people who are neurotypical, right? Peer relationships, positive peer interactions and friendships support social skills and self-esteem. Negative peer pressures or bullying can have adverse effects on your personality development. Community and social supports, a strong sense of community and access to social support networks can foster resilience and well-being, while social isolation can be harmful. Life experiences and events, experience such as trauma, loss, or major life changes can impact development, either by posing challenges or by fostering resilience through overcoming adversity. Biological factors, media and technology, exposure to media and technology can offer educational benefits and connectivity, but can also lead to issues such as cyberbullying or unrealistic social comparison. I think this right now, okay, is like a huge factor that's hindering psychosocial development in kids. It's like unbelievable. It kind of crept up on us. We weren't aware of it. It's like, oh, phones, social media. Oh, this is wonderful. Now we're beginning to see the effect. It's horrible. It's huge. Government and policy. Policies can support or hinder developmental development depending on their effectiveness and accessibility. Understand these factors can help in creating environments that promote healthy psychosocial development. So, what I'd like you to appreciate from this is that this is not just up to you. Okay? Healthy personality development has to do with so many factors. Not just you, it's society, it's your parents, it's what happens to you, it's biological factors, it's media and technology, right? So it's complex, right? So we're almost out of time, but I'm almost at the end of the slides here. So how does psychodynamic theory fit in with concepts of emotional, rational, and wise minds that we have been talking about? Okay, so we've been talking about those concepts. Is this like psychodynamic? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to skip over that. You guys can read it. right? So there's a thing, we touched on it, dual process theory. Let's skip over it. Let's skip over that. Because I do want to take some questions. Okay, I'm just going to go the last thing. I think we touched briefly on this in the past. Last thing I want to just touch on, because I think this is like one of my favorite things, is the Stanford marshmallow experiment. You might have heard about it, which is really about personality development, right? And from early on. So this is a famous experiment conducted by Walter Mischel in 1972. Children in the study were led into a room and a marshmallow was placed in front of them. They were told they could eat the marshmallow if they waited 15 minutes in the room alone, sorry, that should be alone. When the experiment returned, they would be given a second marshmallow as a reward. So they said, you can eat this marshmallow. I'm going to be gone for 15 minutes. But if you don't eat the marshmallow, when I come back, I'll give you another marshmallow. So it's about how well their superego can control their id, right? And you can tell a lot how kids are going to do. So the researchers followed, this is the interesting part, is that they followed these kids into the future. So they did this and they saw some kids just ate the marshmallow right away, and there's movies of this. There's actually videos on YouTube and you see like kids like, they're struggling. And it's like, they're doing all kinds of things. They're distracting themselves, right? To try not to eat the marshmallow because they want the reward. So they're very amusing. But the researchers followed these children through their adult lives and found that those that were able to wait 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow were more competent adolescents, did better in school. So it already says something about their personality development at that age. Imaging studies revealed that the prefrontal cortex, a part of the irrational brains, kind of the wise mind really, was more active in those who were able to wait, right? So that's like the brakes. The prefrontal cortex, the wise mind, the ego is functioning well. And whereas the ventral striatum, a part of the emotional brain, was more active in those who could not stop from eating so they were more emotional. So they were following their hunger, their impulses, right? The experiment measured the balance between systems 1 and 2 that I skipped over. Okay, so I think this is the last slide that I have. Yeah, this last slide. Yeah. I'll skip over the last ones to go to questions. So the Stanford marshmallow experiment is a famous psychological study on delayed gratification, where it's conducted by Walter Mischel and his colleagues in the late 60s and early 70s at Stanford University. The experiment involved children, typically around 4 to 6 years old, who were given a choice between one small reward, like a marshmallow or cookie, that they could eat immediately, or a larger reward if they waited for about 15 minutes while the researcher left the room. The key aspect of the study was observing whether the children could resist temptation to eat the marshmallow immediately in order to receive a greater reward later. The researchers followed up the participants years later to assess the long-term implications of their ability to delay gratification. The original findings suggested that children who were able to wait longer for the larger reward tended to have better life outcomes in various domains, including they had better academic success. Children with late gratification were found to score higher on SAT scores and better academic performance, social competence. They were also reported to have better social skills and more likely to cope well with stress and frustration, health and well-being. Follow-up studies suggested that these individuals had better health outcomes and lower rates of substance abuse. Career success. Some studies indicated those who delayed gratification more successful in their careers. So this talks about the importance, even at ages 6 or 7, about personality development, right? And if your personality development is hindered and you're going to be more emotional, you don't have a wider window of tolerance, it greatly affects outcomes. So I think it's we'll stop there. We have about 5 minutes for question. I apologize for going over time a little bit. Yes. Lily.
They control for